Where did your family originate from?
My mom's side of the family is from what is now Croatia. When she was born, it was in between Italy and Yugoslavia. And my dad's side of the family is from Italy.
Why did you start researching your family tree?
The reason that I started researching was because I have two older sisters, and they're both 10 and 11 years older than me. So growing up, I actually never met my dad's parents, my grandparents on my father's side. And my grandparents on my mother's side were very old, and luckily my grandmother lived until she was 100, but I didn't really get to know my grandfather that well. So just out of curiosity, I was just trying to understand my immediate family, my grandparents, and in talking to my mom and talking to my father, just kind of learning that they themselves led very interesting kind of journeys over here. And the more that I went to look into it, the more interesting the stories became to me.
When you start researching, what's the first step, the first thing you do?
The first thing that I do when researching, or the first thing that I did when I started researching, for me, it was very organic, and I just started talking to my parents. And then they started talking, or they introduced me to family that I had met when I was a child, but I had talked to my cousin who's a judge in Italy, or my cousin in the Bronx who knows my dad's side of the family. So that was kind of my immediate. And then I started to branch out from there using Ancestry.com or, different resources, even just going to the public library and seeing if I could dig up documents that way.
In practical terms, how important is the internet in researching family history?
Yeah, and I think the internet obviously is extremely important. I mean, it just makes finding information and being able to look at so many different resources so much easier. Something that would take probably months or a year, you could probably do in a few days or a few weeks online. And just the communities of people that you can be introduced to that have done similar things to you, I think that's a huge benefit as well. So you could start talking to people who give you advice, just going to message boards and seeing what people have done in the past. And a lot of times hurdles that you might come across, they have already solved them for you. They have hints for you about how to get past them. So I think that's, to me, has been the biggest help.
How far back have you been able to trace your family?
I've been able to go back as about 4 generations with my family. I'm still searching and still talking with some family members in Italy about what information they know, and trying to use local offices there to see if I can get marriage licenses and birth certificates of my grandparents and their parents. But it's, the further back you go, it becomes a little bit more difficult. So I'm at about 4 generations now.
Why did you go to Ellis Island?
I feel Ellis Island was a good place because it was such a hub of activity, and there is so much information that is at your disposal. So again, it kind of allows you to see, when your family came here, it's that initial stepping stone that they started with.
How did you feel when you went there?
It was the first time that I'd been to Ellis Island, and having grown up in New York, that's kind of quite surprising that I'd never been there. For me, it was just, I felt like I was kind of walking through history a little bit, and it was much different when, my great uncle was coming through, but you kind of still get that sense of the hope and the freedom that, knowing that my immediate family was trying to just leave such poverty and, really seeing that American dream and having that hope, you kind of just get that sense of so many people were coming through here, and this was just like, I finally made it, and you kind of feel that as you're walking around.
And what did you find out about your family there?
When I went to Ellis Island, I was able to find on my dad's side, when his great uncle came over, a lot of the documentation that, or the documentation when he actually came over.
And how did that make you feel when you found that?
When I came across his documentation, it was a very emotional moment. It made it made an aspect of the story very concrete for me, just knowing that he, did come across and he kind of went through the hallways of Ellis Island, and, it allowed me to create in my own mind a very specific, concrete event that happened. So oftentimes when you're doing research, it can be very abstract and you're just kind of learning a piece of this and a piece of that. But seeing something very physical just kind of brought it home for me.
And your dad's great uncle helped the rest of the family to come?
My dad's great uncle actually sponsored the majority of my dad's family to come over. So along with my grandparents, my uncle, my father, the other side of my father's family, his cousins, their parents. So he was the first person that, when he came over, he was, I believe, 15, and just kind of working in the streets, working as an ice vendor, working construction, and slowly but surely, he was able to bring the majority of the family, who at the time was living in southern Italy, which at that time there wasn't much going on in southern Italy, to come over and, plant roots in New York. Without him, I probably wouldn't be here because my dad would have never come over and met my mom. So, I think the courage that he had to come over, especially by himself, and to bring the rest of my family over was something very heroic to do.
During all the research which you did into your family tree, did you find out anything which surprised you?
I did find some surprising stories. When my mom left, she had a passport just to go visit her sister in Italy, and she basically left the country illegally, and she sought political asylum in Italy, and she had to live in a refugee camp for about a year. And my aunt at the time, they wouldn't allow her a passport, so she had to basically cross the border running through the woods with her 2 kids in the middle of the night. So, as you start to just hear these, even first account stories, second account stories, it's just very interesting to understand the difficulties that your family had to go through sometimes to just create a better life for, at the time they didn't know I was going to be around.
And what did you find out about how your parents met in New York?
In talking to my parents, when my mom came over in 1960 and my father came over in 1961, even though they had very similar cultures, they also had a lot of differences. So they didn't actually speak the same language. And having met in English school, I thought, that was pretty surprising. Even though they both lived in New York, it kind of brought a sense of how New York and the US really is a melting pot. And, it took a little while for them to I guess my mom to warm up to my dad. But, once they understood that a lot of their cultural backgrounds were very similar, the whole family started to hang out, and my mom became very close with my would-be grandmother, or her would-be mother-in-law.
What would you say to somebody who is thinking of researching their family tree?
I would recommend for anybody looking to start, who is possibly thinking about doing some research into family history, to just start talking to your family. That's how I started, and it's very easy, assuming that your family is there and they have the history. It's a way to just kind of start, and for me, it's led down this path where I've decided to research further and further. But I also did feel it was a bit of an obligation for me to understand so that I can pass it along to my kids and to my grandchildren. Because, if I would have never started asking my mom, I wouldn't be able to tell my kids about my uncles coming over from, to America in the 1920s and, working as an ice vendor, or my great uncle rowing across, in the middle of the night to escape Yugoslavia. So to me, it's led to a lot of information that now I can pass along. And, to me, it's that aspect is important. And the more that I went to look into it, the more interesting the stories became to me. And then I started to branch out from there using Ancestry.com or, different resources. Even just going to the public library and seeing if I could dig up documents that way. I was able to find on my dad's side, when his great uncle came over, a lot of the documentation or the documentation when he actually came over. When I came across his documentation, it was a very emotional moment. And slowly but surely, he was able to bring the majority of the family, who at the time was living in southern Italy, which at that time there wasn't much going on in southern Italy. The whole family started to hang out, and my mom became very close with my would-be grandmother, or her would-be mother-in-law.